For busy while I handle the accounts. She won't even know what hit her." My son's voice was low, almost swallowed by the noise of the other tables around us, the clatter of forks and the low hum of a restaurant trying too hard to feel like home. He was leaning toward his wife, Claudette. Both of them turned slightly away from me like teenagers passing notes in class. They thought I was absorbed in the menu. I had been holding it open for the past 3 minutes, staring at the same line about the grilled salmon, not reading a single word. It was the afternoon of my retirement party, 31 years at the Allegheny County Clerk's office, and my son, Raymond, had insisted on taking me to lunch to celebrate. He had made the reservation himself. He had picked the restaurant, a steakhouse downtown that I never would have chosen, the kind of place where the portions are enormous and the lighting is too dark. He had even ordered the bottle of wine before I arrived, which he'd never done in his life because Raymond does not spend money he doesn't have to spend. That should have told me something. Claudette laughed softly at whatever he said next and touched his wrist in that quiet way. Married people touch each other when they've agreed on something. Then she looked up, found my eyes over the top of my menu, and smiled the way you smile at someone you've already won against. I smiled back. I set the menu down and asked for the salmon. To understand what I was sitting across from that afternoon, you have to go back to 1987. I was 34 years old, recently divorced, with 2 children under the age of 10, and a studio apartment in Pittsburgh that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes no matter how many times I scrubbed the walls. My ex-husband, Leonard, had left owing 3 months of back rent and the kind of chaos that takes years to fully excavate from your finances. I had a part-time job at the county recorder's office making $9 an hour. I had a mother who lived in Ohio and couldn't help. I had 2 kids who needed shoes for school and a checking account with $42 in it. What I also had was a clear head and a stubbornness that certain people have since mistaken for stupidity. I took the full-time position at the clerk's office the same week Leonard moved out. I worked days, took night classes at Community College of Allegheny County twice a week, and studied for my paralegal certification at the kitchen table after the children went to bed. Raymond was 9. His sister Noelle was 7. They learned early how to make their own lunches and how to be quiet while Mum studied. Neither of them complained, at least not to me. In 1994, I bought my house. It was a narrow 2-story on Ferris Street in Carnegie, 1,200 square feet, 1.5 bathrooms, a kitchen that needed new cabinets, and a backyard just large enough for a folding table and a garden I never got around to planting. The mortgage was $412 a month. I signed the papers with my own hand, with my own credit history, with a down payment I had saved by not buying new furniture for 3 years and eating lunch at my desk every single day. I remember standing in the empty living room the afternoon I got the keys, looking at the water stain on the ceiling that the inspector had marked as cosmetic, and thinking, this is mine, all of it, including the water stain. My children grew up in that house. Raymond had the bigger bedroom because he was older and because Noelle said she didn't mind, which she did, but she was gracious about it in the way that second children sometimes are. I repainted the kitchen cabinets myself. I replaced the water heater in 1999 and the roof in 2008, both times by doing the research, getting 3 quotes, and making the decision alone. Raymond moved out at 22 to take a job with a logistics company in Columbus. He married Claudette 3 years later. She was fine in the beginning, polished, organized, the kind of woman who sends thank you notes within 48 hours. I told myself the initial stiffness between us was just adjustment. Nellie moved to Portland. We talk every Sunday. She has never asked me for money. Raymond's relationship with money was a different story. It wasn't that he was reckless exactly. It was more that he had a talent for arriving at the edge of a financial problem and then looking toward me to make it go away. There was the car loan I co-signed in 2011 that he was late on twice before paying off. There was the $3,000 I lent him in 2015 when Claudette's mother's funeral expenses landed harder than expected. That money was never repaid, and after about a year I stopped mentioning it because the conversation it started wasn't worth having. There was the Christmas visit in 2019 when Claudette pulled me aside to mention that they were thinking about buying a house and wondered if I had considered updating my will. I was 66 years old and in excellent health. I told her I would give it some thought. I did not give it some thought. I gave it about 10 seconds, and then I thought about something else. What I didn't know, Or rather, what I hadn't fully assembled into a complete picture was how consistently Raymond had been treating my house on Ferris Street as a future certainty. Not an inheritance he hoped for, a resource he was planning around. I only understood this when, 6 months before the retirement lunch, I overheard a phone call that I was not supposed to hear. I had driven to their house in Columbus on a Thursday in April, surprising Raymond with a casserole for his birthday the following weekend. He'd told me not to make the drive, that it was too far, that he'd come to Pittsburgh instead, which he wouldn't have. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. I let myself in, called out, and heard his voice from the back of the house, on the patio, talking to someone on speaker. I set the casserole on the counter and stood still. The voice on the other end was a man I didn't recognize. He spoke in the measured, careful way of someone very comfortable giving advice that skirts along the edge of what's proper. Raymond was asking about timing, about how long a process like this typically takes, about whether their situation, a mother in her late 60s, living alone, increasingly isolated, some memory concerns would qualify. Memory concerns. I stood in that kitchen and listened to my son describe me to a stranger, not me. A version of me he had constructed, symptom by symptom, to fit a legal framework. He said I had missed a grandchild's birthday call. He said I had left the stove on twice. He said Claudette had noticed I seemed confused at Christmas. He said they were worried. The man on the phone said the words limited conservatorship and petition to the probate court, and typically granted within 90 days when the petition is well documented. Well documented. I picked up my keys from the counter and walked out of that house. I left the casserole. I drove 45 minutes toward the highway before my hands stopped shaking enough for me to trust myself at speed. I didn't cry. Crying would have required me to be surprised. The drive home gave me time to think. By the time I reached the Allegheny County line, I had already decided 3 things. First, I was not going to confront Raymond. Not yet, and possibly not ever, because confrontation would alert him that I knew, and knowing that I knew would change his timeline. Second, I was going to call a lawyer. Not the family attorney who had done my original will, but someone new, someone I found on my own, with no connection to anyone in my life. Third, I was going to protect what I had built before anyone had the chance to petition a probate court about my memory concerns. The lawyer I found was a woman named Elspeth Darrow, a 60-year-old estate attorney in Squirrel Hill who had a framed needlepoint on her wall that said, "Document everything," and who listened to my account without a single interruption. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "You're not the first person who has sat in that chair and told me that story. You won't be the last." We spent the next 2 months restructuring everything. The house was the central concern, and we approached it carefully. I had 3 options. I could place it in a revocable trust with very specific successor trustee instructions. I could sell it outright and convert the equity into protected financial instruments, or I could transfer it to an LLC with myself as the sole member, which would create a layer of separation between the asset and any future conservatorship proceeding. The trust was the cleanest option. We established it within 30 days. Under the terms of the trust, I remained the beneficiary and the trustee for my lifetime. The successor trustee was not Raymond. It was Elspeth's firm, with clear written instructions about what would trigger a transition of management and what would not. A conservatorship petition by a family member would not. The trust also contained a no-contest clause, meaning any beneficiary who challenged its terms would forfeit their share entirely. Noel was the secondary beneficiary. Raymond received a specific bequest, $15,000, nothing more, with a letter of explanation sealed inside the trust documents that would be opened only upon my death. Elspeth also helped me open new accounts Raymond had no knowledge of, at a credit union across town. My pension from the county. I had retired with a pension of $2,100 a month after 31 years, plus Social Security that brought me to just over $3,400 a month, was redirected to the new accounts. My old bank account stayed open with a small balance, active enough to look unchanged. I moved through those 2 months like I was doing a job, which, in a way, I was. Filing paperwork, signing documents, attending appointments. At no point did I make a decision without consulting Elspeth, and at no point did I tell Raymond or Claudette that anything had changed. They visited twice during that period. Both times they were warm, attentive, helpful in the way that people are helpful when they want something. Raymond fixed the loose railing on the back porch without being asked. Claudette brought a casserole. The irony was not lost on me, and asked several careful questions about whether I had thought about selling the house now that I was retiring, whether the upkeep was getting to be too much, whether I had looked into any of the senior living communities near Noel in Oregon. I said I was still thinking about it. I was not thinking about it. My actual retirement party was a quiet lunch with 4 colleagues from the clerk's office, 2 weeks before the official date. We ate at a diner on Forbes Avenue, and they gave me a card signed by everyone in the department and a Barnes & Noble gift card for $100. It was exactly what I wanted. The lunch Raymond arranged was a different kind of party. He chose the steakhouse. He made the reservation. He arrived early and ordered wine, and at the table, while I held the menu and pretended to consider the salmon, he leaned toward Claudette and told her to keep me busy while he handled the accounts. He meant my accounts, my checking account, the one he had the routing number for from the car loan I co-signed 11 years ago. He planned to spend the lunch hour on his phone or perhaps slipping away to the restroom for an extended period, initiating a transfer. Moving money from my account into a joint account he and Claudette had probably prepared for exactly this purpose. This was apparently what they had decided to lead with before the conservatorship paperwork went any further. Small, deniable. Just moving funds to protect Mom. I know all of this because of what happened when he came back to the table. He had excused himself 20 minutes into the meal. A call from work, he said. Very quick. I watched him cross the restaurant, not toward the restrooms, but toward the front entrance, where he stood with his back to the room and his phone pressed to his ear. Claudette asked me about my plans for the garden this summer and whether I had thought about getting a dog for company. I said I was leaning toward a dog. I said I'd been looking at rescue organizations. I was very good at this by now. Raymond returned to the table 31 minutes later. I know it was 31 minutes because I counted. He sat down and immediately reached for his wine. His jaw was tight. He cut into his steak and chewed and did not make eye contact with me for almost a full minute. Claudette said, "Everything okay?" He said, "Fine." He was not fine. He had discovered, apparently, that the account he had the routing number for had $312 in it. He had also discovered, perhaps, that any attempted transfer had bounced or been flagged, because I had left instructions with the credit union about exactly this kind of attempt. I don't know precisely what he encountered on his end. I know only what I saw, which was a man who had expected to come back to the table with something already accomplished and who instead had nothing. I picked up my fork and asked about my grandchildren. He answered mechanically. Claudette had recovered better and carried most of the conversation for the next 20 minutes, telling me about my grandson's soccer season and a vacation they were planning. I listened and nodded and finished my salmon. When the check came, Raymond paid for it without comment. He always paid for things when they hadn't gone the way he planned. It was a habit I recognized. Outside the restaurant, he hugged me on the sidewalk and said we should do this more often. I agreed. Claudette hugged me too, and her perfume was the same one she'd worn for 15 years. A fact I noticed because it was the kind of thing you notice when you are paying very close attention to everything. I drove home. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and looked at the room I had lived in for 30 years. The cabinet I repainted in 2003. The window with the broken latch I kept meaning to fix. The small crack in the ceiling plaster above the light fixture that had been there since the winter of 2010. And that I had decided to call a character detail. It was mine. All of it still mine, and now protected in a way that Raymond's lawyers were going to find very difficult to unravel. A week later, a certified letter arrived from an attorney's office in Columbus. Raymond and Claudette had filed a petition in the Allegheny County Probate Court, alleging that I lacked the mental capacity to manage my own financial affairs, citing evidence including financial decisions inconsistent with prior patterns and failure to maintain contact with immediate family. They were requesting a 60-day emergency conservatorship. I called Elspeth before I even finished reading. Right on schedule, she said. Is this serious? It's a filing. We will respond to it. Do you have time Thursday morning? I had time Thursday morning. The court process moved slowly and then all at once. Elspeth filed a formal response within 48 hours, attaching the trust documents, my financial records for the preceding year, and letters from my physician, my optometrist, and 2 former supervisors at the county clerk's office attesting to my cognitive and professional functioning. She also filed a motion requesting that the court appoint an independent guardian ad litem to evaluate my capacity, rather than relying solely on the petitioner's characterization of my behavior. The guardian ad litem was a woman named Dr. Tan, Constance Reeve, a clinical psychologist who specialized in elder capacity evaluations. She came to my house on a Tuesday and spent 3 hours asking me questions, giving me standardized assessments, and observing how I managed my home. I showed her my medication organizer, current and accurate. I walked her through my monthly budget spreadsheet. I showed her the 3 pending library books on the counter and told her which one I planned to start that evening. She asked me why I had moved my accounts. I told her the truth. I told her I had overheard a phone call. I told her what was said. I told her I had consulted an attorney, made a plan, and executed that plan over the course of 2 months without help from anyone, because I did not need help. I told her that what might look like financial decisions inconsistent with prior patterns was, in fact, a woman protecting herself from people who wanted access to her savings. Dr. Reeve wrote for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up and said, Mrs. Callahan, and I told her that wasn't my name, that I had gone back to my maiden name after the divorce, Dunmore. And she corrected herself and said, Mrs. Dunmore, I want you to know that I take no side in this proceeding, but I will tell you that what you have just described to me, the sequence of decision-making, the consultation of legal counsel, the deliberate protection of your assets, is not consistent with cognitive impairment. It is consistent with competence. She said it again at the hearing. The hearing was held 6 weeks after the petition was filed. A probate courtroom in the Allegheny County Courthouse, wood paneling, fluorescent light, the faint smell of recycled air. Raymond and Claudette sat at a table to the left with their attorney, a man named Doyle who had the look of someone accustomed to winning in rooms like this. I sat to the right with Elspeth, in the grey blazer I had bought specifically for the occasion. Doyle presented his case first. He talked about my age. He talked about the financial changes, which he called erratic and unexplained. He said that I had withdrawn from family relationships. He mentioned the stove. He mentioned the missed birthday call. He presented a letter from a neighbor, a woman who had moved onto Ferris Street only 2 years ago, and whom I had spoken to perhaps 4 times, who described seeing me standing in the driveway looking confused. I had been looking at a bird, a cedar waxwing, which is not common in that neighborhood. I had been standing in my driveway looking at a cedar waxwing. Elspeth presented Dr. Reeve's evaluation, which was thorough and clear. She presented my financial records, which showed 31 years of responsible management. She presented the trust documents, which demonstrated not impulsivity but planning. She called my former supervisor from the clerk's office as a character witness. She called my physician. Then she asked me to speak. I said, I am 67 years old. I raised 2 children by myself on a paralegal salary in a county government office. I bought my home alone. I paid it off alone in 2019, ahead of schedule. I have never been late on a utility bill, a mortgage payment, or a tax return in my adult life. I moved my money because I heard my son plan to take it, and I protected it because it was mine to protect. I do not need a conservator. What I need is for my son to understand that I am not a problem to be managed. I am his mother. The judge was a woman about my age. She listened with the particular attentiveness of someone who has heard many versions of this story and is no longer surprised by any of them. The petition was denied. She said it clearly, with the kind of language that doesn't leave room for misinterpretation. The petitioner had failed to demonstrate by clear and convincing evidence that the respondent lacked the mental capacity to manage her own affairs, and that the respondent's financial decisions, while unfamiliar to her family, were rational, legal, and consistent with a person acting to protect her own interests. Raymond did not look at me when the ruling was read. Claudette did. Her expression was not angry exactly. It was something I had no name for, a look that would take me weeks to fully understand. It was the look of someone recalibrating. Outside the courthouse, Elspeth shook my hand. She said, "You did everything right." I said, "I know." I called Noelle from the car. She had known about the petition. I had told her 3 weeks earlier after some deliberation, and she had offered to fly out and testify. I had told her to stay in Portland. Her being there would have complicated things, made it seem like a family war rather than a straightforward question of my competence. But hearing her voice after the hearing was the closest I came to crying that entire year. She said, "So it's over?" I said, "That part is." The weeks after were quiet in the way that follows a long storm. Raymond called once, about 10 days after the hearing. He said he wanted to talk. I said I wasn't ready. He called again 2 weeks later. I said the same thing. I wasn't ready because I was thinking carefully about what I wanted from whatever came next, and I had learned by then that making decisions while still in the middle of your feelings is how you end up making the wrong ones. I had 31 years of waiting for the right moment before I signed a document. I could wait a few more weeks. What I did instead was live. I slept past 7 for the first time in decades. I finished a novel in 2 days and immediately started another. I took a continuing education class at the Carnegie Mellon Community Program, Architectural History, something I had always meant to look into. And I sat in a classroom with people of all ages and took notes in a paper notebook and was better at it than half the people there, which I say not to brag but because it mattered to me to know that. I adopted a dog, a 6-year-old beagle named Harold, from the Humane Animal Rescue, and Harold became the best decision I had made in years that didn't involve an attorney. My pension and Social Security gave me more than enough. The house was in trust, secure. The investment account Elspeth had helped me establish was modest, not extravagant, but steady. I was not wealthy. I did not need to be wealthy. I needed only what I had, which was the product of 31 years of choosing correctly under difficult circumstances, and which was now, formally and legally, beyond reach. Raymond wrote me a letter in the fall, handwritten, which surprised me. He said he was sorry. He said the financial pressure had made him do something he couldn't fully explain, and that he knew sorry wasn't enough, and that he wasn't asking for anything. He just wanted me to know. I read it twice. I set it on the counter. I left it there for 4 days, which was how long it took me to decide how I felt about it. What I felt was tired, not angry, not vindicated, tired in the way you feel after carrying something heavy for a long time and then setting it down. Not relief, exactly, but the sudden awareness of how much effort you had been expending without realizing it. I wrote back. I told him I had received his letter and that I believed he was sorry. I told him that believing someone is sorry is not the same as knowing that what they're sorry for will never happen again. I told him I loved him because he was my son, and because 31 years of raising a child doesn't disappear because the child does something unforgivable. I told him that I was not ready to see him yet, and that I would let him know when I was. I mailed the letter. Noelle came in December, flew in from Portland with her husband and their youngest, a 9-year-old named Thea, who came into my kitchen and immediately asked if Harold could sleep in her room. I said yes. We had 3 days of the most ordinary and welcome life. We made pie from scratch. We watched old movies. Thea read to Harold on the couch with a kind of seriousness that children have when they're trying to impress an animal. On the last morning, Noelle sat across from me at the kitchen table with her coffee and said, "You seem different." I asked her how. She said, "Like someone who doesn't have to brace anymore." I thought about that for a long time after she left. Like someone who doesn't have to brace. Because she was right. There had been a permanent tensing in me for so long that I had stopped noticing it. The low-grade monitoring of what Raymond might need, might ask for, might try to take. Not because I expected catastrophe every moment, but because experience had taught me to stay alert. 30 years of staying alert. That was gone now. Or most of it was. I was under no illusions that life had stopped containing difficulty. Harold got into the trash can regularly. The crack in the ceiling plaster was a 1/4 inch wider than it had been in 2010. I had a property tax bill due in February and a continuing education registration fee I kept forgetting to pay. But in the evenings, when I sat in the living room with Harold asleep across my feet and the street outside going quiet, I felt something I can only describe as my own. Not the house, though the house was mine, legally and undeniably. Not the money, though the money was safe. Something that had always been mine and that I had sometimes lost access to, my own mind, my own judgment, the right to be exactly as capable as I had always been without having to prove it to anyone in a courtroom. I had proved it. It was over. Outside, the first snow of the season had started to come down. Fine and unhurried, covering the street and the yard and the backyard, where I still hadn't gotten around to planting a garden, but where I now thought I might in the spring. Harold lifted his head, looked at the window, and then set it back down on my foot with a long sigh. I reached down and scratched behind his ear. 67 years old, and I was just beginning to understand what it meant to live without apologizing for my own competence. It was more than enough.